The wind had a dry, bitter edge to it that morning, like it had clawed its way over 3 counties just to sting her cheeks. The sun, low and pale, threw long shadows across the parched grass, and not even the birds dared to sing. The trees stood like solemn witnesses, stripped of all comfort, as if they had turned their backs on the woman kneeling by the shallow creek. Her dress was torn at the hem, sleeves soaked and clinging to her thin arms as she struggled to cup water for her children. Beside her, 2 small figures, one boy, one girl, sat silently, not crying, not asking questions. They had already learned that questions were a luxury the starving could no longer afford. Her name was Ellen Whitmore, though there was no one left to say it kindly. Once she had been the wife of a proud settler. Once she had played piano on Sunday afternoons, read poetry aloud, and felt the small dignities of domestic life. But those things felt like relics from a time long buried. All that remained now was the memory of her husband's hand in hers, calloused, steady, and the echo of his final breath, stolen by a fever no doctor could name. They had buried him beneath a cottonwood tree. She remembered the way her in-laws stared at her afterward, like she was just another mouth to feed, a reminder of a man they'd rather forget. The day they turned her out, they said it was mercy, said they had no choice, said the Lord would provide. But the Lord, it seemed, had gone silent. For 3 days she wandered with her children, surviving on roots and hope, until even hope began to taste bitter. Her boy Jacob tried to carry their last crust of bread in his shirt pocket, only to drop it crossing a stream. Her daughter Leila hadn't spoken since the second day. She just stared, big eyes sunken, hair matted from wind and dirt. Ellen knew they were closed to death. She could feel it in her chest, not as a fear, but as a quiet settling, like the way dusk settles on the plains, final, unforgiving, inevitable. She didn't see him at first. He was still as the trees, half shrouded in branches above the ridge, a solitary figure watching from atop a boulder that overlooked the creek bend, wrapped in a faded wool blanket and a bone-handled knife strapped across his chest. He looked like something carved from the very hills, a Cherokee warrior, though Ellen didn't know that yet. Not by name, not by tribe, just a shape, just a man, the kind of man who, in stories, might vanish with the fog or appear in times of trouble. But this was no story. This was real, and it was cruel, and Ellen had no room left for legends. Still, when she stood and turned toward the woods, she felt eyes on her, a presence. Her spine stiffened with fear, but her limbs were too tired to run. She braced for whatever would come, be it animal, outlaw, or ghost. The man didn't move. He watched her a while longer before he stepped forward, slow, deliberate. His boots barely disturbed the brush. When he emerged into full view, Ellen saw the lines on his face, weathered, stern, but not unkind. His hair was braided tight, silver streaks catching the light. He looked to be near 40, maybe more, and his eyes held the kind of silence that had seen too much. She reached instinctively for her children, pulling them close. Jacob tried to be brave, squaring his little shoulders like his father once had. Leila just stared, hollow and unmoving. The man raised his hands not high, not in surrender, but open, empty palms, a gesture without words. "I ain't got nothin' worth stealing," Ellen said, voice dry and cracking. "Not even hope." He looked at her for a long while, then nodded once. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. you need food. It wasn't a question. She said nothing. I have fire, he added, shelter, water that don't come with mud. Still she hesitated. He glanced at the children, then back at her. You're dying. You don't have to. Ellen hated how much she wanted to believe him. Her pride rose like a wounded animal, snarling in her chest. But pride wouldn't feed the children. Pride wouldn't keep the fever from Leela's lungs. And pride wouldn't stop death. What do you want in return? She asked, her voice colder than she intended. The man didn't blink. Nothing. Liar, she thought. Everybody wants something. But something about his eyes gave her pause. Not pity, she'd seen plenty of that. And it always came with conditions. No, what she saw was different, older, like he'd known. Hunger, too, and shame, and grief too heavy for language. He turned and started walking, not waiting for her to follow. Where you talking us? Jacob called out, uncertain but hopeful. The man didn't stop to live. The boy looked up at Ellen. She could barely stand, but she gathered what little strength she had. Her legs buckled, then, steadied with one child in each hand, she followed the stranger into the trees. Behind them, the creek kept whispering to no one. They walked a mile, maybe two, before coming to a clearing where a small shelter stood, made of logs and stone. A fire already burned, its smoke curling soft into the sky. There were bundles of herbs hung from branches, a stack of dried fish, and a skin stretched for tanning. It was humble, but it was more than she'd had in weeks. The man motioned for them to sit near the fire. He handed her a bowl of warm stew, thin, but rich with flavor. The first bite made her chest take, as if her body couldn't believe it was real. He said nothing more that night, only sat across from them, carving a piece of wood with patient hands. Ellen watched the flames dance on his face and wondered what kind of man saves a stranger and asks for nothing. The children slept beside her, their breathing steady for the first time in days. Ellen didn't sleep, not yet. She kept one eye on the man across the fire and one hand over her children, and for the first time since her husband died, she didn't feel entirely alone. Not safe, not quite, but not alone. And that, for now, was enough. Before the war, before the trails westward, before his people were herded like cattle across state lines drawn by pale hands, he had a name that carried meaning. His father had given it to him with fire in his breath, standing beside a red river swollen with spring rains, but the soldiers who came later could not pronounce it, nor cared to learn, so they gave him a new name, asterisk, asterisk, Daniel, asterisk, asterisk. Simple, forgettable, that was the point. But to his mother, he was always asterisk, asterisk, Gola, asterisk, asterisk, meaning winter in her tongue, not for the cold, but for the endurance, the way winter survives, waits, watches, the way it bends but does not break. He had walked long roads since then, watched brothers die in battles that were never theirs, dug graves for children who never got to choose which flag flew over their heads, and somewhere along the way, Gola forgot what it felt like to build instead of bury, until the woman and her two children showed up at the bend in the creek. They had haunted his dreams at night, not with cries or screams, but silence, that terrifying quiet that hunger brings, and the woman's eyes, not wild, not weak, just done, like the world had finally convinced her she wasn't worth saving. But he'd seen enough dying, too much. He had no words to give her, only space, food, shelter, the little things that keep a soul from giving up entirely. In the gray morning light, Ellen awoke to the sound of a pot boiling and a blade sharpening, not in a threatening way, but rhythmic, precise. Daniel was crouched near the fire, slicing roots into thin pieces. He didn't look up. "You slept," he said, like it was a fact worth marking. Ellen sat up, her arms stiff. Her children were still wrapped in the blanket he'd given them, soft and worn and smelling faintly of cedar. "Don't know when I last did," she murmured. He nodded. "That's why you're still breathing." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Over the next few days, the silence between them became less about distrust and more about peace. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't preach or pry. He simply gave her things: warm broth, berries, a dry place to sleep. Each small offering was a thread, stitching something back together inside her that she thought was beyond repair. And the children, they began to return to themselves. Jacob followed Daniel everywhere, mimicking his steps, asking questions about traps, knots, trees. Leela, quieter still, would sit beside the fire and run her fingers over the carved figures Daniel whittled from fallen branches: birds, foxes, once even a bear. One morning she handed him a rock shaped like a heart. He took it, nodded, and placed it on a shelf made of pine. Ellen watched this unfold with a cautious heart. She didn't want to hope, not yet. Hope, she'd learned it, had sharp teeth. But it was hard not to soften when the children smiled. Hard not to trust a man who asked for nothing and gave what little he had. One evening, as the firelight flickered and the stars blinked open above the treetops, she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest like a stone. "Why are you helping us?" Daniel didn't look up from the bundle he was tying. "Why wouldn't I?" she snorted, more bitter than amused. "Because the world's made it clear that nobody helps without a reason." He tied the knot slow and firm. "Maybe the world's wrong. You don't even know us. I've seen enough to know when someone's close to the edge." She wrapped her arms around her knees, stared into the fire. "We were past the edge. You just happened to catch us on the way down." He didn't argue. Later that night, she walked a few yards away from the fire and stood beneath the trees. The moon was full and low, painting everything silver. Her feet were bare against the cool dirt. For the first time in weeks, she felt the air in her lungs without coughing. Her bones still ached, but her soul felt less brittle. Behind her, she heard the soft tread of boots. "Do you miss them?" she asked without turning. "Your family." Daniel stood beside her now. "Every day." "What happened?" He was quiet for a long time. "They didn't make it." "I'm sorry." He nodded. "I lost mine too," she said. "My husband." Then his family turned me out, said they couldn't keep me and the children. Daniel didn't speak, but his stillness spoke volumes. "I thought maybe I was cursed," she whispered. "You're not." "How would you know?" "Because I've been cursed. This what you're doing, it's survival, not punishment." She turned to him, the moon catching her face. "What about you? Why are you out here? Alone?" He met her gaze. "Because sometimes people need to be alone to remember who they are." Ellen nodded slowly. "And sometimes," he added, "they need someone else to remind them their worth." Remembering. A breeze stirred the leaves. Somewhere a coyote cried in the distance. She didn't say thank you. Not yet. The words didn't seem strong enough. But she looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since her husband's death, her guard lowered, not all the way, but enough to let the warmth back in. That night she fell asleep without fear, and Daniel for the first time in months, dreamt of something other than blood, and wintered out the storm arrived with no warning, just a wall of wind that tore through the trees like a fist. Ellen had barely stepped outside to check the smoke pot when the sky turned black and the ground trembled underfoot. A branch cracked overhead. Leela screamed. Jacob ran to the door, his boot slick with rain. Daniel didn't panic. He moved like someone who had lived through worse, snuffing out the fire with one sweep, slamming the shelter's wooden door shut, and reinforcing it with a thick beam carved long ago for just such a purpose. Not leave him alone, but she saw in his eyes what he couldn't say. If they stayed, the children might not survive, so she kissed Leela's forehead, told Jacob to be brave, and led them through the back hatch Daniel had carved months ago hidden beneath pine boughs. They moved quickly, Ellen clutching the rifle. The children, running close behind, the woods swallowed them in moments. Back at the shelter, Daniel stood tall when the men returned. They didn't knock this time. They kicked the door open, expecting an empty hut or a frightened man begging for mercy. Instead, they found Daniel seated by the fire, cleaning his blade with slow precision. Well, now, the first one said, a tall man with a yellow scarf tied tight around his neck. Ain't you brave? Daniel didn't speak. Another man stepped forward, rifle aimed low. Where's the woman? Daniel looked up. Gone. You let her get away? No, I sent her. The third man laughed. That's so mighty noble of you. I don't need to be noble, Daniel said. Just fast. The first man took a step forward, gun raised. He never got a second one. Daniel moved like lightning, knife drawn, striking with precision. The man dropped, clutching his side as blood bloomed across his coat. The second raised his rifle, but Daniel ducked behind the fire pit, rolled, and came up with a tomahawk from behind the logs. The fight was fast, brutal. The shelter's walls shook. Again, not from storm this time, but from chaos. In the end, 2 men lay groaning on the ground. The third had fled into the woods, bleeding and howling. Daniel didn't give chase. Instead, he packed quickly food, water, herbs, and slipped into the forest the same way Ellen had gone. Hours later, as twilight bled into the hills, Ellen sat on a boulder overlooking the ridge trail. The children slept beneath her coat, and the cold bit her knuckles. She feared the worst. Then, crackling underbrush, a shadow moved between the trees. Her hand reached for the rifle. Don't, came his voice, low and tired. She rose to her feet just as Daniel stepped into the fading light, blood on his sleeve, a gash across his brow, but upright. She rushed to him, grabbing his arm, steadying him. You came back, she whispered. Told you I would, and that was all. She helped him sit, cleaned his wound, and for the first time let herself cry, not from fear or grief, but relief. Because he had fought for them, not out of obligation, not because it was his duty, but because something deeper had begun to grow there in the silence between firelight and storm, something neither of them could name yet. Long before she knew his story, Ellen had trusted Daniel. It was instinct, not the kind passed down from books or sermons, but the ancient kind that comes from fear and fire and nights spent trying not to die. She trusted him with her children, her safety, her breath, but trust and understanding are not the same thing. Trust is survival. Understanding is something gentler, something earned. That morning, after the men had been buried under pine needles and loose dirt, and the fire was rebuilt. Ellen sat beside Daniel and finally asked the question she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest. "What made you stay out here?" Her voice was quiet, but not unsure. "Not just this week, I mean before." "Before us." Daniel sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the flames crackle. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "You know about the Trail of Tears?" Ellen nodded. "School books don't say much, but yes. My grandmother walked it," he said, voice even. "She lost her son, my uncle, on the second week. Fever. My grandfather didn't make it either. By the time they reached the camps, she had buried most of her family under strange trees with no names." Ellen didn't speak. She told me stories about the old way, before the forced marches, before treaties that broke like river ice in spring. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but memory. She said we came from people who believed land couldn't be owned, that water should run free, and names should hold meaning. Ellen looked down at her hands, pale against the bark of the log. "My people did the forcing." Daniel didn't respond right away. Then he said gently, "Your people are your children now." She looked at him, surprised. "You can't change where you come from," he continued, "but you can raise something better." That struck something deep in her, a truth she hadn't known she needed after the war. Daniel went on, "I tried to live in their towns, tried to be like them, took jobs, cut my hair, even wore their boots. But no matter what I did, I was always the Indian." He said it like a scar. "So I left, came back to the land, built this place with my hands, not because I hated them, but because I didn't belong among them." Ellen reached out slowly, not quite touching his hand, but close. "You belonged to someone once, didn't you?" He nodded. "She was strong," he said, "and wild, died giving birth to a son who didn't live a day." The fire popped between them. Night was settling in. Ellen whispered, "I'm sorry." "So was I," he said. Until now, the silence between them shifted, no longer empty, but full. That night they didn't sleep apart. They didn't hold each other like lovers. Not yet, but they shared the fire, shoulder to shoulder, letting the quiet speak all the things neither of them could. The days that followed were calm, almost unnaturally so. The air was cool. The game returned to the woods, and the creek ran clear again. Jacob practiced with a slingshot Daniel made him. Leela began speaking again quietly at first, then with giggles. She told Daniel one afternoon that his carved bird looked grumpy, and he laughed for the first time in Ellen's presence. Not a polite laugh, a real one. It shook something loose inside her. One morning, Daniel taught the children how to read tracks in the dirt. Ellen watched from the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, a soft smile tucked into the corner of her lips. They looked like a family, something new, something unspoken. But peace, like fire, must be fed, and danger, like winter, always circles back. A week later, Daniel returned from the ridge with a troubled brow. "There's smoke," he told her. "Not ours." Ellen straightened. "The men from before?" "No," he said. "This is military bluecoats." Her stomach dropped. "You think they're looking for someone?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they're just reminding folks they still own the land. Will they come here?" He paused. "They'll pass close." They spent the day gathering what they could. Daniel taught Ellen which herbs to hide, which tracks to erase. That night they slept with one ear open, and sure enough, by mid-morning, the riders appeared. 6 of them, in full uniform, clean boots, clean rifles, clean orders. They didn't knock. Daniel stood in the center of the clearing as they dismounted. Ellen kept the children hidden behind the shelter, hearts pounding. "Name," the officer barked. Daniel didn't answer. "Where's your permit to settle here?" "No answer. You're on state land. You can't be here without declaration." Daniel stared at the man and moved. "You speak English?" the officer asked, mocking. "Better than you," Daniel finally said. The man's face turned red. "Do you have anyone else here?" "No." Ellen flinched behind the wall. "Then I suggest you pack up and move along," the officer said, his voice sharp now. "Unless you'd prefer to be escorted off." Daniel's mouth curled just slightly. "You gonna carry me?" The officer stepped forward, hand on his sidearm, but another soldier, younger, held him back. "Not worth it, sir," the younger man said. The officer sneered. "You've got 1 week." They left with dust in their wake, eyes full of suspicion. When they were gone, Ellen stepped out. "You lied," she said quietly. "I did," he said, "but I won't again." She nodded. "I can't stay if they come back." "I know," he said. She looked at the children, then back at him. "And we can't go without you." The words hung in the air. Daniel walked toward her, slow and sure. "Then we'll leave together." It wasn't a promise made of flowers or ceremony. It wasn't even romantic. It was stronger than that. It was a decision. Years later, when Jacob was a man and Leela had children of her own, they would still tell the story of the day they left the mountain, not because it was grand, not because it was brave, but because it was the day their lives took root somewhere new when something broken was carried forward, not as a burden, but as a seed. The morning they left was gray, not stormy, not cruel, just quiet. The kind of morning that doesn't speak, only listens. They left no note, no signpost, only the bones of what had been a few logs, a cleared path, and a small wooden bird carved and resting beside the doorway. Leela had placed it there herself. Their journey eastward was slow. The children grew tired often, and Ellen's ribs still ached from the lean days. Daniel carried more than his share, but he never complained. Each night they stopped near water, built a fire, and kept their silence short and their warmth close. Ellen didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. The destination wasn't a place, it was a future. Still, one evening, as the stars came out, she found herself watching Daniel closely. His eyes scanned the tree line, always alert, always cautious. "Do you think they'll follow?" she asked. "No," he said. "They don't follow people they can't control." "What if they try?" He stirred the fire, the embers glowing soft red. "Then they'll regret it." His words were simple, but she believed them. By the 3rd week, the land began to change. The hills grew softer, the soil darker. There were fewer military patrols and more homesteads. Ellen worried about how folks would treat them, her, a pale widow with 2 children, and him, a Cherokee man with a knife always within reach. But something unexpected happened. People were tired, not of Daniel or Ellen or even the war. They were tired of hate, of loss, of trying to find someone else to blame for their own hunger. And when Daniel traded skins for flour and Ellen offered help at a field planting, they were welcomed cautiously at first, but genuinely. One family, the Coles, took a special liking to Leela, the matriarch, a sharp old woman named Ruth. Saw the girl's quiet strength and offered her a book. Leela held it like a treasure. That night, She read aloud by firelight, her voice soft and sure. Jacob found work helping repair wagons, and Ellen picked up sewing where she left off all those years ago. Daniel built strong things, barn doors, fence posts, a reputation. The children grew stronger. Their laughter returned not all at once, but like the thaw after a long frost, and Ellen she stopped waiting for grief to wake her each morning. It still visited now and then, but not like before, not like a weight pressing her into the dirt, more like a shadow that passed quietly behind her. Daniel never asked her to be his wife. There was no ceremony, no preacher, no ring. But he began to sleep beside her every night, to share the work and the worrying, and to hold her hand as they walked to the creek. That was enough. One spring morning, nearly a year after they had left the shelter, Ellen found Daniel standing in the garden behind their new home. He was staring at a small tree, thin, young, but strong. Jacob had planted it months before. Ellen stepped beside him. It's taken root. Daniel nodded. So have we. They stood in silence for a moment. I still think about him, she said softly. My husband. You should, Daniel replied. He's part of you. She looked up at him. And you? I carry more names than I can count, he said. But now I carry yours, too. Ellen leaned her head against his shoulder. Later that summer, a letter arrived. It was from the same in-laws who once sent her into the wilderness. News of sickness, loss, regret. She read it twice, then placed it in the fire. Daniel didn't ask what it said. Some things don't need retelling. The years rolled on. Leela grew into a storyteller, sharing their journey with anyone who would listen. Jacob joined a wagon repair company and later became a respected craftsman. The land they lived on, once wild and uncertain, grew into something steady, something safe. People in nearby towns began to whisper about the widow and the warrior who made a life out of nothing, how he'd fought off raiders and taught white children how to track deer, how she had sewn dresses for families who once ignored her, how together they had carved peace from ruin. But none of those stories captured the truth. The truth was quieter. It was in the way Daniel made breakfast before the sun rose, always setting a plate aside for Ellen, in the way she knew his shoulder ached when the weather changed, and how she rubbed it without a word, in the way they lived and married by law, but bound by every other measure. One autumn morning, Daniel didn't rise with the dawn. Ellen found him sitting by the hearth, eyes closed, fire burned down to ash. She didn't cry right away. She simply sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered his real name. Not Daniel. Cola. Winter. He had endured. He had waited, and now he rested. The townspeople came in quiet waves, some to pay respects, others just to see the woman who had survived everything. Ellen stood at the small stone she placed by the tree Jacob planted on it. She carved no dates, just 3 words. He chose mercy. Years later, when Ellen passed, Leela buried her beside him. No church, no ceremony, just the roots of that same tree, grown thick and steady, weaving between their resting places. Their story lived on, not in books, not in records, but in the lives they changed, the children they raised, and the love they built without permission, because sometimes the strongest love isn't shouted from pulpits. Sometimes it's whispered in a storm, shared over fire, and written in footsteps through wild land.